When did a student put your entire career in jeopardy? Kimberly stumbled into my office sobbing so hard her whole body shook. Ms. Moreno, I'm pregnant, she choked out. My parents will kill me. They'll disown me. I can't tell them. I moved my chair closer and lowered my voice. Breathe with me. In through your nose, out through your mouth. How far along? 4 months, she whispered, clutching her oversized hoodie. I kept hoping the tests were wrong. She glanced at her stomach as if it might answer for her. I asked if she'd seen a doctor. She shook her head hard. They'll tell my parents. I'm on their insurance. They check every explanation of benefits. They'll know. I slid pamphlets across my desk, adoption resources, local women's clinics, Planned Parenthood, and explained options in a neutral voice, pressing the importance of medical care. There are confidential clinics, I said. Sliding scale. No insurance needed. She pushed the papers away. They track my phone. They check my bank. If I'm not where I'm supposed to be, they call the school. Her fear was practical, obsessive. I asked about the father. James is at MIT, she said, voice breaking. He doesn't even know. I documented the conversation, scheduled a follow-up, and gave her my number. She left clutching 2 pamphlets like talismans. I felt uneasy, very aware of how fragile things could go wrong. Kimberly started coming in twice a week. Each visit showed her unraveling. Her face thinned, cheekbones sharp beneath baggy hoodies. Her jeans hung loose despite the roundedness at her middle. Are you eating enough? I asked once. I'm fine, she insisted, fingers trembling. Just morning sickness. But morning sickness at 4 in the afternoon, teary irritability, and weight loss in pregnancy set off alarms in my head. I warned her about malnutrition, about risks to the fetus. At our 5th session, she said, I've been researching. Her eyes avoided mine. There are clinics that understand my situation. I explained the danger of unlicensed providers and back alley procedures and marked reputable clinics on the pamphlet. She took them, but I could see she'd already made up her mind. 2 weeks later, she arrived frantic. Her hoodie couldn't hide the belly anymore. She looked 6 months along and exhausted. I found a place, she said. They'll help me and my parents will never know. When I asked for details, name, location, licensing, she deflected, muttering about privacy and special circumstances. I documented everything, appearance, evasive answers, and the clinic she wouldn't name. Let me drive you to Planned Parenthood, I begged. They have counselors. She snapped. I said I'm fine, stood up unsteadily, and left. She stopped coming. I checked with teachers. She was still in class, but increasingly unwell. Confidentiality rules tied my hands about contacting parents unless there was imminent danger. I called her once. It went to voicemail. My chest tightened the way it does when you know a small crack will become a fissure. The morning it broke, I was in a budget meeting when the secretary burst in. Emergency in the science wing. A student is hemorrhaging. I dropped my coffee and ran. Outside the chemistry classroom, a crowd had gathered. Through a gap, I saw Kimberly on the floor, a dark pool spreading beneath her. Mr. Roberts, the chemistry teacher, was kneeling beside her, pressing towels to her abdomen. She just collapsed, he kept saying. There's so much blood. Phones were out. Students recorded and cried. EMTs arrived and moved with focused urgency. IVs, oxygen, stretchers, while I helped clear a path. Paramedics radioed about severe hemorrhage and possible pregnancy complications. I followed the ambulance to the hospital, my mind a jumble of every conversation and pamphlet, every refusal. In the ER waiting room, time became elastic. Kimberly's parents arrived frantic, her mother clutching a rosary. A doctor pulled them aside. When he re-emerged, Mrs. de Blair collapsed and her husband supported her, sobbing. The baby had been delivered but was far too premature, tiny and fighting on machines. Kimberly had lost massive amounts of blood and lay unconscious. Hours later, a nurse's face told us the worst. The baby hadn't made it. Kimberly stabilized but remained unconscious. When she woke 12 hours after the collapse, I sat with a social worker and her parents in the sterile room. She was small and fragile in the hospital bed, IV lines in both arms, hair damp at her temple. Her mother stroked her hair with a violence that read like regret. Her father stood rigid, jaw clenched. Who knew about this? Her mother asked, voice low and lethal. Who knew you were pregnant and said nothing? Kimberly's eyes found mine. She raised a trembling hand and pointed. Ms. Moreno knew, she said. She gave me the pills. She said it was the only way. She forced me to take them. The social worker's pen stopped moving completely, and I felt all the blood drain from my face while Mrs. Blair's eyes turned to me with pure rage. Her husband's jaw clenched so tight I could see the muscle jumping under his skin. I opened my mouth to deny it, but no sound came out at first. My throat felt closed up and my hands started shaking in my lap. The social worker looked between us with careful eyes while Kimberly kept her face turned away from everyone. I finally managed to push words out and said this was absolutely not true, and I never gave Kimberly any pills. The social worker started writing everything down fast while Mrs. Blair jumped up and started screaming at me. She called me a murderer and said I killed her grandchild, and how could I do this to a child? Her voice got louder and louder until security guards appeared at the door looking worried. Mr. Blair grabbed his wife's arm, but she kept yelling about how I should be in jail. The social worker stood up and asked everyone to calm down right now. She said this was now a mandatory reporting situation that had to be documented properly. She looked at me and said I needed to leave the room immediately while they took Kimberly's statement. My legs felt like jelly when I stood up and I had to grab the chair for support. Kimberly still wouldn't look at me and kept staring at the wall instead. The social worker opened the door and waited for me to walk through it. Hospital security guards were waiting outside and one of them took my elbow to guide me away. They walked me down the hall to a separate waiting area far from Kimberly's room. I sat down hard in a plastic chair and my hands were shaking, so bad I could barely hold my phone. I called my union rep right away and tried to explain what just happened, but my voice kept breaking. He told me not to talk to anyone else about this and said he was on his way. The waiting room had bright lights that hurt my eyes, and a TV playing some cooking show nobody was watching. Other people sat around looking tired and worried about their own problems. I kept replaying Kimberly's words in my head and couldn't understand why she would lie like that. My phone buzzed with texts from other teachers asking if I was okay, but I didn't answer any of them. 2 hours passed before police officers walked into the waiting area and asked for me by name. They said I needed to come to the station for questioning about a serious allegation. I texted my union rep Aditya Sharma fast, and he replied that he'd meet me there. He reminded me not to answer anything without him present no matter what they said. The drive to the station felt unreal, like I was watching someone else's life fall apart. The officer driving didn't say anything, and the radio played static between dispatch calls. At the station, they took me to a small room with a metal table and uncomfortable chairs. Detective Alan Cervantes came in and read me my rights while I waited for Aditya to arrive. He asked if I understood, and I nodded, but didn't say anything else. 20 minutes later, Aditya walked in wearing a suit and carrying a briefcase. He sat next to me and told the detective we were ready to proceed. I explained every single interaction I had with Kimberly from the first day she came to my office. Aditya took notes on a yellow pad and kept telling me to stay calm and stick to documented facts. I told them about the pamphlets and the resources, and how she refused real medical help. The detective asked specific questions about dates and times and what exactly I gave her. I pulled out my phone and showed him pictures of my session notes from every meeting. The notes showed I only gave Kimberly pamphlets about legitimate clinics and adoption resources. Detective Cervantes asked about my whereabouts over the past month and wanted to see my phone records. Aditya said we'd cooperate fully, but insisted on proper warrants for anything beyond voluntary cooperation. The detective made copies of my notes and said he'd be in touch about next steps. We left the station and Aditya told me to go home and wait for his call. That evening, Principal Lillian Kelly called my cell phone with a heavy voice. She said she was sorry, but I was on paid administrative leave effective immediately. She explained it was standard protocol when such serious allegations came up against staff. I wasn't allowed on the school property or to contact any students or staff about the case. She said she personally didn't believe the accusation, but her hands were tied by district policy. The next morning, Aditya showed up at my house with coffee and a box of folders. We spread everything out on my dining room table and went through every single document about Kimberly. We made a detailed timeline showing when she came to sessions and exactly what we discussed each time. Aditya photographed every page and told me to scan everything and make backup copies immediately. He said we needed to be ready for whatever came next in the investigation. News of the accusation spread through the school community faster than anyone could control it. Parents started posting on social media demanding to know what kind of counselors the school employed. Some called me a monster, while others said they didn't believe it could be true. My Facebook feed filled up with horrible comments and threats from people who didn't even know me. Aditya told me to delete all my social media accounts right away before things got worse. Detective Cervantes called 2 weeks later asking Aditya if I knew when Kimberly was getting released from the hospital. Aditya told him we didn't have that information, but the detective said she'd gone home that morning and her parents had basically locked her down completely. The social worker at the hospital had called him worried because they'd taken her phone and installed cameras in her bedroom and wouldn't let her leave the house even for therapy appointments. He said CPS was opening a case, but it would take time to investigate properly. That same afternoon, Aditya showed up at my house with a thick folder of papers he'd gotten from a contact at the insurance company. He spread them out on my kitchen table and pointed to each page showing Kimberly's parents had been checking every single medical claim for the past year. The records showed nothing beyond her counseling sessions with me at the school and one strep throat test 6 months ago. No prescriptions for any pills, no visits to any clinics, no pregnancy-related medical claims at all. This backed up everything I'd documented about her being too scared to use real medical services because her parents would find out. Aditya took photos of every page and said this was exactly what we needed to show she was desperate enough to go outside the system. 3 days later, my phone started blowing up with texts from other teachers saying videos were going viral on TikTok. Students who were in the hallway when Kimberly collapsed had posted their recordings, and one showed her walking toward the chemistry room already holding her stomach with blood visible on her jeans before she even fell. Aditya immediately contacted the students through their parents asking for original copies of the videos for evidence. Most agreed to help once they understood it was to clear my name. The timestamp on one video proved she was already bleeding at 8:47 a.m. when I was documented being in a budget meeting on the other side of the building. The school board called an emergency meeting that Thursday night, and the auditorium was packed with angry parents demanding answers. Principal Kelly stood at the podium trying to explain that investigations take time and due process exists for a reason, but people kept shouting over her. One parent yelled that I should be in jail, and others clapped. Kelly raised her voice and said facts matter more than emotions, and that rushing to judgment helps no one. She got criticized hard for defending me, but she kept repeating that the district had to follow proper procedures. After the meeting, she texted me privately saying she was taking heat but believed in my innocence. Meanwhile, Detective Cervantes had been busy interviewing Kimberly's friends and classmates. He called Aditya to report that several girls said Kimberly had been acting strange and scared for weeks before the collapse. One friend admitted Kimberly had asked to borrow money about a week before everything happened, but wouldn't say what it was for. The friend felt guilty but had given her $200 in cash because Kimberly seemed desperate. The detective was building a timeline of Kimberly's actions in the weeks before she took the pills. Aditya decided we needed to prove my session notes weren't created after the fact, so he hired a digital forensics expert to examine my computer files. The expert came to my house with special software and spent hours analyzing the metadata on every document. She printed out reports showing each note was created and saved on the exact date and time I claimed with no modifications afterward. The computer's internal logs proved I'd been documenting everything in real time, not making up evidence later. This would counter any claim that I was fabricating my defense. About 3 weeks after the accusation, the detective got a major break in the case. The motel mentioned in those Telegram chats had security cameras, and he'd gotten a warrant for the footage. He showed Aditya a grainy video of Kimberly entering room 114 with an unidentified woman 2 days before her collapse. The timestamp showed 3:17 p.m. on a Tuesday when she was supposed to be at violin practice, according to what she'd told her parents. The woman was wearing a baseball cap and sunglasses, but was clearly not me since I was 5 inches shorter, and was teaching a conflict resolution workshop at the school that day with 20 witnesses. I felt relief seeing proof she'd gone somewhere else for those pills, but also deep sadness that she'd felt so desperate and alone that she'd trusted some stranger from the internet over legitimate medical help. CPS formally opened their investigation into Kimberly's home environment after getting multiple reports about concerning levels of control. They interviewed Kimberly at home with a patient advocate present while her parents had to wait in another room. The advocate later told the detective that Kimberly seemed more afraid of her parents' anger than anything else, and kept asking if they could hear her answers. She was shaking the whole time and kept looking at the door. Finally, Alyssa Mansfield agreed to give an official statement, but only after the prosecutor promised she wouldn't face any school punishment for her involvement. She came to the police station with her parents and explained she'd driven Kimberly to that motel because Kimberly was terrified her parents would see any rideshare activity on their tracking apps. Alyssa felt horrible about what happened, but said she was just trying to help her friend who seemed absolutely desperate and had nobody else to turn to. She'd waited in the car while Kimberly went inside and came back out 20 minutes later with a small paper bag. The woman from the motel footage stayed unidentified, but police traced the Telegram account to a network operating across 3 states, selling abortion pills to desperate teenagers for the past 2 years. A month crawled by with me stuck at home watching daytime TV and checking my phone every 5 minutes. Aditya finally called saying we were meeting with the DA tomorrow to present everything we'd gathered. I barely slept that night. The next morning, I put on my best suit and met Aditya at the courthouse where he carried 2 thick binders full of evidence. The prosecutor's office was smaller than I expected, with stacks of files everywhere. Aditya laid out our defense piece by piece, starting with the medical timeline showing Kimberly took those pills at least 12 hours before our last meeting. He showed the motel footage of her meeting that unknown woman. He presented my session notes with the digital forensics proving I'd written them in real time, not after the fact. The prosecutor nodded along, taking notes, but stopped us halfway through. She said the evidence looked solid, but without Kimberly admitting she lied, they still had to consider charges because of public pressure. My stomach dropped. 2 days later, Aditya called with news that made me throw my coffee mug at the wall. The Blair's attorney filed a motion to suppress the motel footage, claiming it violated Kimberly's privacy as a minor. We had to go to court just to keep our best evidence. The hearing was scheduled for that Friday. I sat in the back of the courtroom watching the lawyers argue while the judge frowned at his notes. The Blair's attorney claimed the footage was obtained without proper consent and showed a minor in distress. Aditya countered that it directly related to false criminal accusations against me. The judge took 20 minutes to decide, but finally ruled the footage was admissible since it showed Kimberly obtaining the pills she later blamed on me. The Blairs stormed out, and that night their Facebook group posted even worse things about me being a predator who was manipulating the system. The next week brought more bad news in the form of a certified letter from the school district. They were scheduling an employment hearing to determine if I'd violated any policies regardless of criminal charges. The letter listed potential violations including failure to report, inappropriate student contact, and negligence. Aditya said this was standard procedure, but warned me the hearing would be hostile since parent groups were pressuring the board. We spent 3 days preparing with him, grilling me on every possible question they might ask. The hearing took place in the district office conference room with 5 board members, 2 parent representatives, the superintendent, and an HR specialist. I sat at a table facing them like I was on trial. They started with basic questions about my training and experience, then moved to Kimberly. I presented my complete documentation showing every interaction we'd had and explained how I'd followed protocol at every step. I showed them the pamphlets I'd given her and my notes urging her to seek medical care. 3 of my colleagues testified next, including the principal, who said I was the most thorough counselor she'd ever worked with. The parent representatives kept pushing, asking why I didn't just call her parents anyway. I explained the law about confidentiality and mandatory reporting over and over. After 4 hours, they said they'd review everything and make a decision within 2 weeks. I left feeling drained and defeated even though I'd done nothing wrong. That weekend, Aditya called with huge news that made me actually smile for the first time in weeks. Detective Cervantes had gotten Kimberly's phone back from her parents through a warrant, and the forensics were incredible. The phone showed searches going back 2 months for things like how to get abortion pills without parents knowing and Teen Pregnancy Help Anonymous. These searches led directly to those Telegram groups where she'd found the woman at the motel. The detective said this proved she'd been planning this long before she ever came to me for help. Even better, the phone had no communication between us beyond my single voicemail checking on her. 5 weeks after that awful hospital room accusation, something finally shifted. Kimberly's patient advocate called the detective saying Kimberly wanted to meet with her and a therapist without her parents there. The Blairs fought it, but the judge approved it as part of the CPS investigation. I wasn't there, but heard what happened from Aditya later. Kimberly broke down sobbing and admitted she'd lied about me giving her the pills. She said her parents were screaming at her in the hospital demanding to know who helped her, and she was terrified they'd hurt her or throw her out if they knew she'd gone to some stranger from the internet. She pointed at me because she knew I couldn't prove a negative, and her parents already hated that the school had counselors who talked to kids about immoral things. The advocate helped Kimberly write out a new statement over the next 2 days with the therapist present to make sure she wasn't being coerced. In the statement, she admitted getting the pills from someone she met online through a Telegram group, not from me. She still wouldn't name the specific person, saying she was scared of what might happen, but she was clear that I never gave her anything except pamphlets and advice to see a real doctor. The statement went to Detective Cervantes and the prosecutor immediately. When the Blairs found out Kimberly had recanted, they went nuclear trying to stop her from changing her story. Their attorney filed emergency motions claiming she was manipulated and brainwashed by liberal officials. The judge had enough and ordered a formal hearing where Kimberly would have to testify about what really happened. CPS recommended she stay with an aunt during this time since her parents were becoming increasingly aggressive. The hearing was set for the following Monday. I was allowed to attend but had to sit in the gallery, not at the counsel table. Kimberly looked so small on the witness stand in a simple blue dress instead of her usual hoodies. The judge asked her directly what happened, and she started crying immediately. She told him she'd lied because she was scared and in pain, and her parents wouldn't stop yelling at her in the hospital. She explained finding the pills online and meeting that woman at the motel and taking them alone in her bedroom while her parents thought she was doing homework. Then she turned to look directly at me for the first time since the hospital. Through tears, she said she was sorry and knew it would ruin my life. But she was so scared of her parents she didn't know what else to do. She said I'd only tried to help her and she'd destroyed my reputation to save herself from her parents' anger. I felt my chest crack open with relief and heartbreak at the same time. The next day, the DA's office called a press conference where they officially announced they were dropping all potential charges against me. They said their investigation found no evidence of any wrongdoing on my part and confirmed I'd followed all mandatory reporting requirements. They even praised my documentation and professional conduct. The local news picked it up but ran it as a small story on page 6 while my accusation had been front page. Most people in town had already made up their minds about me anyway. The damage was done even though I was officially cleared. 3 days later, my phone rang while I was eating cereal in my pajamas, and Principal Kelly's name showed on the screen. I almost didn't answer but figured I'd have to face this eventually, so I picked up and she asked if I could meet her at the school that afternoon to discuss my options going forward. When I got there, the parking lot was mostly empty, except for a few admin cars, and walking through those familiar doors felt wrong somehow, like I was trespassing. Kelly met me in her office with coffee already poured, and she looked tired with dark circles under her eyes that makeup couldn't hide. She explained the district was offering me 2 choices. I could return to my regular position here, or transfer to Madison High across town with the same pay and seniority. She said most of the staff supported me and wanted me back, but she understood if I needed a fresh start away from all the whispers and stares. I asked for a week to think about it and she agreed, then walked me out through the side door, so I wouldn't have to pass the main office where people might see me. That same afternoon, Aditya called saying we needed to address the online harassment that was still happening even after I'd been cleared. He'd been screenshotting the worst posts where parents were calling me a murderer and saying I should be in jail regardless of what the investigation found. We spent 4 hours at his office drafting cease and desist letters to send to 12 different people who'd been particularly vicious on Facebook and the local parenting groups. Most of them deleted their posts within 24 hours of getting the letters, but I knew the screenshots were still out there somewhere, and people had already formed their opinions. Meanwhile, the CPS investigation into Kimberly's home situation was wrapping up, and the social worker called to update me on the outcome. After interviewing neighbors and teachers and reviewing all the evidence, they'd determined that the Blairs' extreme surveillance and control had created the dangerous situation that led to Kimberly seeking unsafe options. The judge ordered them to remove all tracking apps from her devices and attend mandatory family counseling twice a week for 6 months. They also lost temporary custody, with Kimberly moving in with her aunt who lived 2 towns over but still in the school district. Mrs. Blair had apparently screamed in court that this was all my fault for corrupting her daughter with liberal ideas, but the judge shut her down fast. 6 weeks after that horrible day in the hospital, I made my decision and called Kelly to say I'd return to my regular position. Running to another school felt like admitting I'd done something wrong, and I knew there were students who needed to see that standing up for the truth mattered even when it was hard. My first day back was scheduled for the following Monday, and I spent the weekend throwing up from nerves and barely sleeping. When I walked into the building that morning, Several teachers were waiting in the main hallway, and they started clapping, which made me cry right there in front of everyone. Not everyone was supportive, though, and I saw some teachers turn away when I passed their classrooms, and heard parents whispering in the pickup line that afternoon. The district had scheduled a meeting that first week where they presented new policies they'd developed based on what happened with Kimberly. They were implementing mandatory training for all counselors and teachers about recognizing signs of family coercion and control, and establishing clearer protocols for helping students access medical care without parental knowledge when legally allowed. They asked me to help develop the training materials, which felt like something good might come from this nightmare, even though I'd rather none of it had happened. 2 weeks after I returned, Kimberly came back to the school part-time while continuing intensive therapy for her trauma and grief. I saw her in the hallway between second and third period, and she was walking with another girl I didn't recognize, both carrying art supplies from the supply closet. She looked different, wearing regular jeans and a normal t-shirt instead of those huge hoodies she used to hide in, and her hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail. When she saw me, she stopped for a second and looked away quickly, but not before I noticed she seemed lighter somehow, like a weight had been lifted, even though I knew she was still dealing with losing the baby. We didn't speak, and I didn't expect we ever would again, but seeing her back in the school trying to move forward was something at least. Detective Cervantes called me at home one evening to update me on the investigation into the illegal pill network. They'd arrested 2 people in connection with the operation, including the woman from the motel footage, though she wasn't talking, and had lawyered up immediately. The main operator was still at large, but they'd shut down 3 Telegram groups and were monitoring for new ones popping up. He thanked me for my cooperation and said my detailed documentation had been crucial in exposing how these predators targeted vulnerable teens whose parents wouldn't let them access real healthcare. 2 months after returning to work, I noticed a shift in how students responded to me. A sophomore came to my office asking for help with her parents' divorce, and actually seemed relieved when I pulled out my documentation forms to record our conversation. Another student dealing with anxiety about college applications said her older sister told her I was the counselor who actually helped kids even when things got complicated. My confidence was slowly rebuilding, though I was way more careful now about documenting everything and making sure students understood the limits of confidentiality from the start. One afternoon, Alyssa Mansfield knocked on my office door looking nervous and asked if she could talk to me privately. She sat down and immediately started apologizing for not coming forward sooner with what she knew about the Telegram groups and driving Kimberly to that motel. I told her she'd shown real courage when it mattered most, and her testimony had probably saved other girls from the same dangerous situation. She was still dealing with guilt about not speaking up earlier, but seemed relieved that I didn't blame her for any of it. The district's insurance company had been dragging their feet on addressing the potential liability from how they'd handled the initial accusation against me. Aditya had been negotiating with them for weeks, and finally called with news that they'd agreed to settle for $15,000 to avoid a longer legal battle. It wasn't much considering what I'd been through, but Aditya had gotten them to include a provision that my personnel file would be updated to note I was fully exonerated of all accusations and had acted with complete professional integrity throughout the situation. The money didn't matter as much as having that official vindication in writing that would follow me if I ever changed districts or needed to defend myself again. 3 days later, the mail carrier knocked on my door with a certified letter that needed my signature, and I saw it was from the district office, which made my stomach drop for a second, until I opened it and found a handwritten letter from Kimberly inside. She'd sent it through official channels, probably because she didn't have my home address, and the district had forwarded it to me with a note saying it had been reviewed for any legal concerns. The letter was 4 pages long, written in neat cursive on lined notebook paper, and she started by saying she was sorry for what she'd done to me, and that she knew sorry wasn't enough, but she needed me to know she understood how badly she'd hurt me. She wrote about how scared she'd been when her parents were screaming at her in that hospital room, and how she'd pointed at me without even thinking, because she just wanted them to stop being so angry at her. She explained how the woman at the motel had seemed so nice at first, and promised the pills were safe and would work quickly, and how desperate she'd been to make everything go away before her parents found out. She wrote about the baby and how she thinks about him every day, even though she only held him for a few minutes before he died, and how her arms still feel empty sometimes. She said her parents barely talk to her now, and her mom cries all the time, and her dad just stares at the TV, and she knows she ruined their family, but she didn't mean for any of this to happen. At the end, she wrote that she understood if I never wanted to hear from her again, but she hoped someday I could forgive her, even though she didn't deserve it. I folded the letter back up and put it in my filing cabinet with all the other documentation from the case because I wasn't ready to decide how I felt about it yet. 3 months after I'd returned to work, the district counseling coordinator called and asked if I'd be willing to speak at the state conference about maintaining professional boundaries while helping students in crisis situations. She said other counselors needed to hear from someone who'd been through what I'd experienced and could explain how proper documentation and procedures had protected me when things went wrong. I agreed, even though thinking about standing in front of hundreds of people and reliving the whole nightmare made me feel sick. I spent weeks preparing my presentation and going through all my notes and documentation to create slides showing exactly what I'd recorded and when. The conference was held at a big hotel downtown, and when I walked into the ballroom, there were about 300 counselors and social workers sitting at round tables with notebooks and laptops ready. My hands were shaking as I clicked through my slides explaining how I'd documented every interaction with Kimberly and followed all the confidentiality laws even when I was worried about her. I showed them the forms I'd used and the careful notes I'd taken, and emphasized how that documentation had saved my career when she accused me. During the Q&A session, counselors asked really specific questions about warning signs I'd missed and whether I'd do anything differently, and I tried to answer honestly without making it seem like I was blaming Kimberly for being desperate. When I finished, the whole room stood up and clapped, which made me tear up a little because these were people who understood how hard it is to help kids when the system ties your hands. The next week, I got an official notice that Kimberly's parents were suing the school district for failing to notify them about their daughter's pregnancy. Their lawyer argued that we had a duty to inform them regardless of confidentiality laws because Kimberly was a minor in medical danger. The district's legal team asked me to submit all my documentation again, showing I'd followed the law exactly and hadn't violated any policies. The case went before a judge pretty quickly because the district filed for summary dismissal based on the clear legal precedent that counselors can't break confidentiality unless there's imminent danger of death or serious injury. The judge read through everything and dismissed the case within 2 weeks, saying the law was clear and I'd acted appropriately given the information I had at the time. The Blair's lawyer actually dropped them as clients after that because he told them it was obviously a vendetta rather than a legitimate legal claim, and he didn't want to risk sanctions for filing frivolous lawsuits. I started seeing a therapist myself about a month after that because I was still having nightmares about that hospital room and waking up in cold sweats thinking about Kimberly pointing at me. The therapist was an older woman who specialized in helping people who'd been falsely accused of crimes, and she understood how complicated my feelings were. We spent sessions working through my anger at Kimberly for lying about me, while also maintaining empathy for the impossible situation she'd been in with her controlling parents. It was hard holding both feelings at once, being furious at her for nearly destroying my life, while also understanding she was just a terrified kid who panicked. The therapist helped me process the trauma of having my reputation destroyed even temporarily, and dealing with people who still believed I'd done something wrong even after being cleared. We worked on techniques for managing my anxiety when triggered by similar situations, and rebuilding my confidence in my professional judgment. About 5 months after everything started, the illegal pill provider network made the local news when police arrested 6 more people in 3 neighboring states for running similar operations. The news showed footage of police raids on motel rooms and storage units full of unmarked pills from overseas, and explained how these networks targeted desperate teens whose parents wouldn't let them access real health care. Some of the parents who'd attacked me on social media started sending private messages saying they were sorry, and they understood now how dangerous these underground networks were, and how kids got pushed into using them when they couldn't get help legally. One mom even stopped by the school to apologize in person, and said she'd been wrong to blame me when the real problem was parents like the Blairs who made their kids too scared to ask for help. 4 months after the accusation, I finally felt stable enough to take on more challenging cases again, instead of just dealing with college applications and schedule changes. A junior came to my office looking scared and asked to talk privately, and when she sat down, she whispered that she was pregnant and didn't know what to do. My heart started racing immediately, and I had to take a deep breath to calm myself before pulling out my documentation forms and explaining the resources available to her. She was scared of her parents finding out, but not to the level Kimberly had been, and she actually agreed to let me drive her to Planned Parenthood that afternoon for proper medical care. I made sure to document everything extra carefully and get her to initial each form confirming what we'd discussed and what resources I'd provided. She ended up telling her parents with the help of a counselor at the clinic, and while they were upset, they supported her through her decision to have an adoption. Seeing her get actual help instead of turning to dangerous alternatives made me feel like maybe I was finding my confidence again, even if I was way more careful now. I heard through the teacher gossip network that Kimberly had graduated early through a special program for students who needed to finish outside the regular school environment. She was living with her aunt now, and had started community college while working part-time at a daycare center, which seemed like a weird choice given everything, but maybe being around babies helped her process her grief. Someone mentioned she was planning to study social work because she wanted to help other teens in impossible situations, and despite everything that had happened, I found myself hoping she'd find her path, and maybe prevent some other girl from going through what she did. Principal Kelly nominated me for a District Excellence Award, which completely surprised me when she called to tell me about it. She'd specifically noted in the nomination how I'd maintained complete professionalism during an unprecedented crisis and had followed all protocols perfectly, even under extreme pressure. I didn't win the award, but just being nominated felt like public confirmation that I'd handled an impossible situation correctly, and several colleagues stopped by my office to congratulate me on the nomination. James, the baby's father, finally found out what had happened when he came home from MIT for summer break, and mutual friends told him the whole story. He reached out to Kimberly, and they met with a grief counselor to process losing their baby together, which made Kimberly's parents furious, but they couldn't legally stop it since she was 18 now. The school board met to discuss the whole situation and voted to increase funding for counseling services and add a part-time social worker position because they recognized students needed more support navigating family crises, and they wanted to prevent another tragedy like this. 5 months after everything started, I was picking up groceries when I saw Mrs. Blair near the produce section, and she noticed me at the same moment. She opened her mouth like she wanted to say something, but then just turned her cart around and walked the other way quickly. I stood there holding a bag of apples and realized she'd lost her daughter's trust, and her grandchild, and all her control over Kimberly's life. I felt sad for everyone, even though she'd tried to destroy me with that lawsuit. The next week, Aditya called while I was grading college recommendation letters to tell me he'd heard through legal channels that the Blairs were getting divorced. Mr. Blair was apparently supporting Kimberly's independence now, and helping her pay for community college, while Mrs. Blair had doubled down on her control issues and moved back with her mother. Kimberly was staying with her aunt permanently now, and the divorce papers showed Mr. Blair citing irreconcilable differences about parenting approaches. A few days later, a junior named Sarah came to my office looking scared and asked if we could talk privately with the door closed. She sat down and whispered that she thought she might be pregnant, and her parents would kill her if they found out. My heart started racing, but I pulled out my documentation forms immediately and had her initial each section as I explained resources. I drove her to Planned Parenthood that afternoon and made sure the clinic documented that I'd only provided transportation and information. She got proper medical care and decided to tell her parents with help from a clinic counselor, and they were upset but supportive. Everything was documented perfectly this time. At graduation in June, several students stopped by to thank me for helping them through tough times over the years. One girl mentioned she'd known I was innocent in the whole Kimberly thing because I'd helped her through her own crisis with such integrity and proper boundaries. These moments reminded me why I'd chosen this job even after everything that happened. 2 weeks after graduation, Kimberly's therapist called to say Kimberly wanted to send me a message through official channels. The therapist read it to me over the phone while I took notes. Kimberly was in therapy twice a week and rebuilding her relationship with her father slowly. She was working part-time at a daycare while taking classes and had created a small memorial garden for the baby at her aunt's house. She was healing slowly and hoped I'd healed too from what she'd done to me. 6 months after that terrible hospital room, I was training a new counselor named Jessica, who'd just been hired for the expanded counseling program. She asked me about handling difficult cases where students might be in danger but afraid of their parents. I walked her through my documentation system and showed her how every interaction needed to be recorded immediately with dates and times and student initials when possible. I explained that documentation wasn't just bureaucracy, but could save your career and reputation if something went wrong. She took notes seriously and asked good questions about maintaining boundaries while still helping students. The district sent out a memo that they were implementing my suggested protocols district-wide starting next school year. Every counselor would need to complete training on documentation procedures and legal updates quarterly. Principal Kelly stopped by my office to joke that I'd become the unofficial expert on crisis management, though we both knew what that expertise had cost me. I was helping develop the training materials and would be presenting at the district conference about maintaining ethical boundaries. I still counseled students every day and still cared deeply about helping them through their problems. But now I balanced compassion with self-protection and made sure everything was documented properly. Kimberly's false accusation had nearly destroyed my life and career, but I'd survived and helped expose that dangerous pill network. The system was a bit safer now for everyone, and that had to be enough. Story's done, but the conversation's not. Hit the comments with your thoughts, and let's see what kind of discussion we can start.